Keir Starmer has made his choice, and it's a choice that should send chills down the spine of every British citizen. Standing before the world, he declares his unwavering support for Ukraine, a nation entrenched in a conflict that shows no signs of ending, a war that has drained Western resources, pushed economies to the brink, and dangerously escalated global tensions. But what Starmer has done goes beyond mere political posturing. He has committed the UK to a path that leads not to peace, but to perpetual conflict, a cycle of war that benefits only those who thrive on destruction. And let's be absolutely clear about what this means. Starmer isn't just calling for support, he's actively preparing for military intervention. A coalition of the willing? That phrase should ring alarm bells. We've heard it before, haven't we? Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. How did those turn out? A decade-long quagmire, thousands of British lives lost, trillions spent, and a world more unstable than ever. But now, Starmer, the so-called moderate, wants to drag the UK into another war under the guise of a peace initiative. Look at the hypocrisy. Starmer stands there, talking about peace while committing the UK to a 30-day ceasefire that does nothing but reinforce Ukraine's position. And where does that leave Britain? Strapped to a failing strategy, locked into a commitment that puts our interests dead last. If Starmer were serious about diplomacy, he'd be pushing for real negotiations, for an end to the bloodshed, not a glorified reset button that lets Zelensky regroup while Western nations foot the bill. And speaking of the bill, who pays for all this? Not Starmer. Not the elites cheering him on from the safety of their offices in Westminster. It's the British taxpayer. The billions already funneled into Ukraine aren't enough, apparently. The weapons, the financial aid, the sanctions that have crippled our own economy while failing to stop Putin, none of it is enough for Starmer. He wants more. More money, more commitment, more sacrifice from a nation struggling with its own crises. Think about it. While Britain faces skyrocketing energy prices, while families choose between heating and eating, while crime runs rampant and infrastructure crumbles, Starmer stands before world leaders and pledges to prioritize Ukraine. Who gave him that mandate? Did you vote for this? Did anyone in Britain wake up and say, yes, let's throw ourselves into another endless war? No. But Starmer doesn't care. He is so desperate to be seen as a global statesman that he will sell out British interests without a second thought. And let's talk about who actually benefits from this strategy. It's not the average Ukrainian, and it's certainly not the British people. No, the real winners are the defense contractors, the political elites, the arms dealers lining their pockets as this war drags on indefinitely. Starmer's so-called commitment to peace is a blank check for the war machine, a guarantee that the UK will remain trapped in an endless cycle of military escalation with no exit strategy. And what about his coalition of the willing? Have we learned nothing from history? This is the same rhetoric used to justify reckless interventions that have left entire regions destabilized for generations. How long before British soldiers are deployed? How long before Starmer, ever the obedient servant to the globalist agenda, starts pushing for direct military involvement? And once that door is open, do you really think it can be shut? Putin is watching. He sees the weakness. Starmer might think his grandstanding makes Britain look strong, but it does the exact opposite. It tells the world that the UK is willing to be led by the nose into conflicts we have no business fighting. That we are an easy mark, a nation whose leaders put foreign interests above their own people. And here's the harsh truth, this isn't about peace. If peace were the goal, the focus would be on negotiations, on de-escalation, on finding a way to end the bloodshed without turning this into another decades-long disaster. But that's not what Starmer is doing. He is setting the stage for prolonged warfare, for deeper entanglement, for a point of no return. The reality is chilling. Starmer has already chosen sides, and it's not Britain's. He has aligned himself completely with Zelensky's regime, no questions asked, no conditions set. This is blind loyalty at its most dangerous. And where does it end? If Russia refuses to back down, if Putin calls Starmer's bluff, what's the next move? Sanctions have failed. Economic warfare has only strengthened Russia's resolve. The only escalation left is direct intervention. And make no mistake, that is where this is heading. Step by step, commitment by commitment, Starmer is walking Britain toward the brink. And when the moment comes, when he stands before Parliament and tries to justify a deeper involvement, will anyone be surprised? Will you be surprised when British troops are sent to stabilize the situation? When the first British casualties come home in flag-draped coffins, will Starmer still stand there and talk about peace? Starmer may present himself as a responsible leader, a man of diplomacy and stability, but his actions betray him. He is a puppet of the global establishment, a politician willing to sacrifice his own country's well-being for the sake of foreign conflicts. And he expects you to applaud him for it. This is not about defending democracy. If that were the case, Starmer would be just as vocal about the corruption in Ukraine, about Zelensky's crackdown on political opponents, about the billions in unaccounted aid that disappear into a black hole. But no, their silence. Convenient, isn't it? And as Starmer continues down this reckless path, who will hold him accountable? The media? They are too busy parroting the official narrative. The opposition? There is no opposition, because the political elite in Westminster all serve the same masters. So, it falls to the people. To those who refuse to be manipulated, who see through the deception, who understand that this war is not our war. Britain is being dragged into another disaster, and the only question left is how far Starmer is willing to go before the nation wakes up. Because if history has taught us anything, it's this: once the war machine starts turning, it doesn't stop. And when the cost becomes too high, when the consequences are irreversible, Starmer won't be the one paying the price. We will. Keir Starmer stands before the world, speaking of a coalition of the willing, a grand, noble idea on the surface, but one that carries the stench of manipulation and reckless ambition. A coalition of the willing? Or a coalition of the manipulated, the coerced, the sacrificial lambs in yet another geopolitical disaster orchestrated by those who will never set foot on a battlefield? The phrase alone should trigger alarm bells. We've heard it before, haven't we? Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. And what was the cost? British soldiers sent to die in conflicts that had nothing to do with defending our homeland, trillions wasted on wars that achieved nothing but devastation, and a political class that never faced the consequences of their decisions. Yet here we are again. Starmer, in his desperate bid to be taken seriously on the world stage, is pushing the UK down a path from which there may be no return. And let's be absolutely clear, this is not about protecting British interests. This is not about peace. This is about Starmer proving his loyalty to the global elite, bending the knee to Washington and Brussels, sacrificing Britain's sovereignty in the name of a war that benefits everyone except the British people. Who exactly are the willing in this coalition? The United States, which will throw money at Ukraine as long as it keeps Russia tied up in a costly war. The European Union, which follows Washington's orders like a well-trained pet, despite suffering the worst economic fallout from this conflict. And now, Starmer wants Britain to lead the charge, to commit not just money and weapons, but our military, our strategic resources, our future, to a war that has no clear exit strategy. Does anyone truly believe this will end with just financial aid and arms shipments? Because that's the lie we were sold in the early days of this conflict: just a few weapons, just a bit of funding, just a few sanctions. And yet, here we are, with talk of military deployments, with Starmer openly stating that Britain must be prepared to defend any peace deal. What does that mean? Are we going to send troops? Are we going to establish a long-term military presence? Are we going to enforce a ceasefire with British boots on the ground? Because that is where this is going. And once we're in, we won't get out. Just like Iraq, just like Afghanistan, just like every other conflict where Britain has been dragged in under false pretenses, we will be stuck in a war with no exit, no clear objective, and no benefit to our nation. But Starmer doesn't care. He doesn't care about the risks, about the lives at stake, about the economic catastrophe he is inviting. What he cares about is looking strong on the world stage, playing the role of the obedient Western leader, ensuring that Britain remains a pawn in the hands of Washington and Brussels. And the cost? Oh, the cost is staggering. Britain is already on its knees, crippling inflation, an economy strangled by endless taxes, families barely making ends meet, while Starmer stands before world leaders and pledges even more British resources to Ukraine. How much more will we be expected to give? How much more will the British taxpayer be forced to sacrifice? And for what? A war we cannot win, a conflict we have no business leading, a global chess game where Britain is being played. Where is the outcry? Where are the voices demanding that Starmer explain exactly what he is committing the UK to? Because let's be honest, this is not about securing peace, this is about prolonging war. This is about trapping the UK in an endless military commitment, ensuring that we are locked into this conflict for years to come, while those who orchestrated it sit safely behind their desks, watching from a distance. And let's not forget, the British people never voted for this. At no point did the public give Starmer a mandate to throw the UK into a war that has nothing to do with defending our homeland. But that has never mattered to politicians like him, has it? They make these decisions behind closed doors, using the language of diplomacy to mask the reality of war. If Starmer was serious about protecting British interests, he would be focused on defending Britain. On securing our economy, on tackling crime, on fixing the broken NHS, on solving the energy crisis that has left millions in financial ruin. But no, his priority is Ukraine. His priority is impressing world leaders. His priority is sacrificing Britain for a war that will only lead to more destruction, more debt, and more lives lost. And let's ask the question no one dares to ask: who truly benefits from this war? Because it certainly isn't the average Ukrainian who has seen their country turned into a battleground for Western interests. It isn't the British people who are being forced to fund a war that brings them nothing but economic hardship. No, the real winners are the defense contractors, the arms manufacturers, the political elites who see war as just another business opportunity. And Starmer is playing right into their hands. The moment he committed to this coalition, he signed Britain up for something far worse than just another round of aid packages. He signed us up for a long-term, irreversible entanglement in a war that will drain our resources, put British lives at risk, and further erode our national sovereignty. And when this war escalates, because it will, when the moment comes that Britain is asked to go beyond just weapons and aid, will Starmer back down? Or will he do what he's been doing all along, say yes to every demand, no matter the cost? Because that is the real danger here. We are not dealing with a leader who has a strategic vision. We are dealing with a politician desperate to prove his loyalty to the global war agenda. And the British people will be the ones to suffer for it. So here's the reality: Starmer's coalition of the willing is nothing more than a coalition of the manipulated. A coalition of nations being pressured, threatened, and coerced into supporting a war that should have ended months ago. A coalition that will drain Britain dry, push us further into economic ruin, and set us on a path that leads only to deeper conflict, greater instability, and a war we cannot afford to fight. And once we're in, there's no way out. But by the time Britain realizes the full scale of the disaster Starmer has committed us to, it will be too late. Keir Starmer wants you to believe he is acting in the best interests of Britain, that his unwavering support for Ukraine is a noble stand for democracy and peace. But peel back the layers of his carefully scripted rhetoric, and what do you find? A man who has sold Britain's sovereignty to Washington and Brussels, a politician so desperate for approval from the global elite that he is willing to sacrifice British resources, British security, and potentially British lives to serve an agenda that has nothing to do with protecting our country. Make no mistake, this is a proxy war, and Starmer is fully complicit in it. Ukraine is the battlefield, but the real players are sitting comfortably in the corridors of power in Washington, Brussels, and now, thanks to Starmer's blind obedience, in London as well. The United States and NATO have found the perfect opportunity to weaken Russia without directly engaging in conflict, using Ukraine as a pawn, arming it, funding it, keeping the war alive while avoiding direct intervention. And now, Starmer is ensuring that Britain is trapped in this dangerous game. Who benefits from this? Because it certainly isn't the British people, who are watching their economy collapse under the weight of spiraling energy costs, mass immigration pressures, and an NHS on its knees. It isn't the Ukrainian people, who continue to be used as cannon fodder in a war that should have ended long ago. No, the true beneficiaries of this war are the military-industrial complex, the globalist elites, and the politicians who profit from keeping the conflict alive. And Starmer is playing his role perfectly. His speech before world leaders was not a call for peace, it was a pledge of allegiance to the architects of endless war. His insistence on forming a coalition of the willing is not about defending democracy, it's about ensuring that Britain remains shackled to NATO's interests, regardless of the cost. It's about proving to Washington that Britain will do as it's told, no questions asked. And here's the terrifying reality: there is no plan to end this war. Every move, every policy decision, every speech from figures like Starmer, Biden, and NATO leaders suggests one thing: they want this war to continue. A war that drags on, weakens Russia, keeps the defense industry flourishing, and justifies even greater military spending, even if it means bankrupting national economies in the process. Look at the absurdity of Starmer's position. He claims to be standing for peace, yet he pushes for more weapons, more money, more military commitment. He talks about diplomacy, yet refuses to acknowledge that peace requires negotiation, not escalation. He condemns Russia's aggression, yet he remains completely silent on the corruption, suppression of political opposition, and military failures of Zelensky's regime. Is this really about principle? Or is it about blindly following orders from NATO and the White House? And let's ask the most important question: what happens when this war escalates further? Because it will. This is not a conflict that can be contained indefinitely. The more weapons are sent, the more NATO pushes the limits of engagement, the closer we get to an irreversible catastrophe. If Ukraine begins using NATO-supplied weapons to strike Russian territory directly, what then? What happens when Russia responds with force, and Britain, thanks to Starmer's reckless pledges, finds itself dragged into a direct military confrontation? And let's not pretend that Starmer will be the one to face the consequences. No, when the situation spirals out of control, when the first British casualties return home in body bags, when the economy collapses under the strain of yet another war, Starmer will be safe behind the walls of Westminster, giving more empty speeches, shifting the blame, claiming he was acting in the interest of democracy. But where was democracy when the British people were asked whether they wanted to be dragged into a war that is not theirs? Who gave Starmer the mandate to turn Britain into an extension of NATO's military ambitions? Who voted for endless foreign entanglements, for economic ruin in the name of standing with Ukraine? No one. But as always, the decisions are made behind closed doors, the deals are struck in secret, and the British public is expected to pay the price without question. And let's talk about the elephant in the room: what if Starmer is wrong? What if this war does not play out as NATO expects? What if Russia, instead of collapsing under sanctions and military pressure, doubles down? What if China steps in with full support, escalating the conflict beyond anything the West is prepared for? What if, instead of weakening Russia, we have only pushed the world closer to a new global war, one that Britain is now fully entangled in thanks to Starmer's reckless promises? Because that is the real danger here. Starmer is not thinking strategically. He is not protecting British interests. He is simply following the script given to him by those who view war as nothing more than a geopolitical chess game. And Britain? Britain is just another piece on the board, another tool to be used and discarded when the time comes. And don't expect the media to challenge him on this. They are complicit too. The mainstream press will not question Starmer's reckless pledges. They will not ask why Britain is being forced into yet another costly foreign intervention while the NHS collapses and crime surges at home. No, they will applaud him. They will call him strong, decisive, a leader who understands the importance of standing against tyranny. But who will stand against the tyranny of leaders who drag their nations into wars without end? Who will challenge the politicians who sacrifice their own people on the altar of globalist ambition? Because that is exactly what is happening. And if the British public does not wake up now, if they do not demand answers, then they will soon find themselves trapped in a war that has no exit, no justification, and no benefit for anyone except the elite who profit from endless conflict. And once Britain is fully committed, once our resources are drained, once our soldiers are deployed, there will be no turning back. This is not a game. This is not about Starmer looking presidential or impressing NATO officials. This is about the future of Britain. And right now, that future is being recklessly gambled away by a man who would rather be a puppet for foreign interests than a leader who defends his own country. Keir Starmer is not negotiating peace. He is not looking for resolution. He is not working in the best interests of Britain. He is, instead, dragging the country into a conflict with no end in sight, with no clear strategy, and with no regard for the consequences. And the most terrifying part? He is doing it without a single moment of hesitation, without questioning the real motives behind this war, without considering the irreversible damage he is inflicting on Britain's future. Listen to his rhetoric. He speaks of defending any Ukraine deal, of strengthening Kiev, of keeping the pressure on Russia, but what does any of this mean for Britain? How does any of this make life better for the British people? It doesn't. It does the exact opposite. It makes life harder, it drains resources, it pushes Britain further into a war that serves the interests of a select few, while the public is left to deal with the fallout. And let's be absolutely clear, this is not about humanitarian support. If Starmer cared about the people of Ukraine, he would be pushing for serious diplomatic efforts to end the war, for real negotiations that bring both sides to the table. Instead, he is signing Britain up for permanent entanglement, for an open-ended commitment to fueling the conflict, ensuring that it drags on indefinitely. How many more billions will be sent? How many more weapons? How many more sacrifices? And at what cost to Britain? The cost is already visible. Skyrocketing energy prices, inflation squeezing working families, a crumbling economy, overstretched public services, and yet, Starmer continues to prioritize Ukraine over his own country. He is pledging more military support, more financial aid, more resources, all while millions of British citizens are struggling to make ends meet. Where is that same level of commitment to solving Britain's problems? But it goes even deeper than that. This is not just about money, about resources, about the absurdity of funding a foreign war while Britain falls apart at home. This is about where Starmer's loyalty truly lies. Because it is not with Britain. It is not with the people who elected him. It is with Ukraine, with NATO, with Washington, with the unelected bureaucrats who dictate the global war agenda from behind closed doors. And that is the great betrayal. Starmer was not elected to be a spokesperson for Zelensky, he was not elected to be a mouthpiece for NATO, he was not elected to drag Britain into a war that it has no business fighting. Yet that is exactly what he is doing. Blindly. Willingly. Recklessly. And here is the terrifying reality: this war is spiraling out of control. Every decision made by the West has only escalated tensions, pushed Russia further into isolation, and made any hope of a negotiated peace more distant than ever. Sanctions have failed. Economic pressure has failed. Military support has prolonged the conflict but has not secured a Ukrainian victory. And now, with Starmer's latest commitment, Britain is not just a backer of this war, it is becoming a direct participant. Where does it end? Where is the exit strategy? Because there isn't one. That is the unspoken truth that Starmer, NATO, and their media puppets will never admit. There is no plan to de-escalate. There is no plan to negotiate. There is only the strategy of war without end. More weapons, more aid, more pressure, until what? Until Russia collapses? Until Ukraine is completely destroyed? Until Britain finds itself on the front line of a war that it was never supposed to be a part of? And what happens when Putin retaliates? Because make no mistake, he will. Moscow has already made it clear that any direct Western involvement will be met with force. But Starmer isn't thinking about that. He isn't considering the possibility that his reckless escalation could provoke a response that Britain is not prepared to handle. And here's the ugly truth: when that moment comes, it will not be Starmer who pays the price. It will be the British public. It will be the soldiers sent to fight in a war that should never have been ours. It will be the working-class families crushed by the economic devastation of a conflict they never asked for. And yet, Starmer still refuses to acknowledge reality. He still speaks as if Britain has some kind of moral duty to lead this charge, as if the nation is obligated to bear the brunt of another war, as if the suffering of the British people is a necessary sacrifice for his place on the world stage. Who gave him the right? Who decided that Britain should carry this burden? Who voted for this war? Because let's be honest, the public never had a say. At no point did Starmer ask the British people if they wanted to be dragged into yet another foreign conflict. There was no referendum, no parliamentary debate that truly considered Britain's interests. The decision was made in secret, behind closed doors, in meetings with NATO officials and global elites who have no concern for the struggles of ordinary citizens. And what happens when the war expands? Because at this rate, it will. Ukraine is not winning. The Western narrative that Russia is on the verge of collapse has been proven false time and time again. If Ukraine begins to falter, if Russia pushes forward, what will Starmer do? Will he send British troops? Will he commit ground forces? Will he push the UK into direct confrontation with a nuclear superpower? Because that is where this is heading. And when the time comes, do you think he will hesitate? Of course not. He will do what he has always done: obey orders, follow the script, sacrifice Britain to preserve his status in the eyes of NATO and Washington. And by then, it will be too late. And let's talk about who truly benefits from this madness. Not the British people. Not the Ukrainians who have been used as pawns in a geopolitical chess game that should have ended long ago. Not the soldiers who will be sent to die in a conflict orchestrated by men who will never see a battlefield. No, the real winners are the arms manufacturers, the war profiteers, the political elites who thrive on chaos and destruction. And Starmer is fully complicit. He is not just a willing participant, he is an active enabler of this war, a man who has signed away Britain's future to forces that care nothing for the country or its people. And he expects you to believe it's all in the name of peace. But there is no peace on the horizon. Only more war. More escalation. More destruction. And Starmer will not stop. Not until Britain is fully entangled in a catastrophe from which it cannot escape. And when that moment comes, who will hold him accountable?